150 cubic kilometers of rock and ash, 60 megatons of sulfur dioxide, pyroclastic flows running about 40 kilometers to the sea, and around 12,000 people gone in the first blow. That is where this story starts, with hot ash in the air, black grit on skin, and a mountain on Sumbawa in Indonesia breaking open in April 1815. The 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora and the year without a summer is usually told as a weather story. It was that, but first, it was a human one. In roughly 2 days, the volcano tore itself apart at VEI 7 scale. Whole communities near it were crushed by the immediate disaster, and tens of thousands more would be lost later to famine and disease. The dead near the mountain were only the beginning. What made this event different was not just the blast, it was what rose above it. While heavier material fell back to Earth, an enormous load of sulfur dioxide reached the stratosphere. Up there, out of sight, it began building a stratospheric sulfate veil that would not disappear in a week or even a season. And that is the part that matters most, because the real target was not only the island below. A year later, cold rain, failed crops, sickness, and one young writer trapped indoors at Lake Geneva would all be caught inside the same chain of cause and effect. If you like deep history told through real mechanisms, subscribe and stay with me, because the mountain's first victims were local, but its next victims were half a world away. What that veil meant on the ground was slower, quieter, and in some ways, worse. On Sumbawa, the air after the blast was not the clean air of survival. It was thick, bitter, scratchy in the throat. Ash lay over homes, cooking pots, paths, fields. A pyroclastic flow had already done its fast work near the mountain, but the next stage came by inches and by days. Food vanished, water turned foul, breathing stayed hard. People who were not killed in the first violence were left inside a landscape that no longer worked. This is where the story of the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora and the year without a summer stops being only about force and becomes about system failure. You can survive the first shock and still be trapped by what comes after it. Crops cannot grow under ash. Animals cannot graze. Trade breaks. Families begin cutting meals, then cutting them again. Tens of thousands would be lost not in a single moment, but in the long, exhausted drag of famine and disease. On Java, Thomas Stamford Raffles, the British official overseeing the region, began receiving reports that sounded almost unreal. Darkness in daytime, ash falling far from the mountain, whole districts thrown into confusion. Months later, Owen Phillips would be sent to see what remained, and what he found was not recovery, but a place where ordinary life had been stripped down to residue. And even then, the island was only the first circle of damage. Above it, the invisible part was still spreading. That spread was the true weapon. Ash is obvious. You can see it on a roof beam, taste it between your teeth, wipe it from your eyelids. The sulfur dioxide that escaped much higher was different. In the thin, cold air of the stratosphere, it changed into a stratospheric sulfate veil, a faint shield of tiny droplets that scattered sunlight away before it could warm the ground for 2 to 3 years. People in 1815 did not have that language. They did not know what was hanging above them. They only saw the symptoms. In London, the sky at evening began to behave strangely. Sir Humphry Davy, the British chemist and president of the Royal Society, noticed changes in the light itself. He could describe what the eye was seeing, but not yet tie it back to Sumbawa. The cause was too far away, too high, too new. And this is where the story starts to turn global. The Earth was already in the Dalton solar minimum, a period of weaker solar activity. So when the veil spread through the upper atmosphere, it met a climate system that was already slightly dimmed. The average cooling that followed, roughly zero point 0.4 to zero point 0.7 degrees Celsius, does not sound dramatic when you hear the number once. But you know how this works. A small average shift can ruin a season. By 1816, fields, orchards, and grazing land across entire regions were about to find that out the hard way. That lesson arrived first as weather that felt wrong in the hands. By August 1815, people far from Sumbawa were already noticing small betrayals in the sky. In Europe, sunsets held on too long, red and copper at the horizon, as if the light had thickened. At sea, captains wrote down odd colors in the clouds. In Bengal, the monsoon came late. In New England, the air in summer carried a chill that did not belong there. None of these observers had the full map. They only had their own window, their own field, their own stretch of water. This is what makes the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora and the year without a summer so hard to grasp in real time. It did not announce itself everywhere with one dramatic sign. It arrived as fragments. A strange dusk in London, a delayed rain season in India, a cold morning in North America. Separate notes scattered across continents, all written by people who had no reason to think they were describing the same event. And yet, they were. The mountain had already done its local damage. Now the atmosphere was doing something colder and more patient. The sulfate haze above the world did not need to freeze every region solid. It only had to shift seasons just enough. Enough to spoil planting, enough to delay growth, enough to keep the ground wet and the air raw. By 1816, that slow sabotage would move from diaries and ship logs into the fields themselves. And once it touched crops, history would start to bend. Once it touched the fields, the disaster changed shape again. In 1816, the cold stopped being an odd sky and became a hand on the harvest. In New England, farmers walked out at dawn and found frost where summer should have been. Young corn sagged, wheat failed to take hold, hay came in thin and weak. In places like Vermont and New Hampshire, the ground itself seemed to deny the calendar. What should have been a growing season turned into a series of setbacks. Plant, lose. Plant again, lose again. Further east, the pattern bent differently, but led to the same fear. In Ireland, cold and rain damaged grain and potatoes together. In Switzerland, summer stayed wet and raw. The year without a summer was a season knocked off balance, then translated into local ruin by each region's own crops, soils, and timing. Thomas Jefferson, writing from Virginia in 1816, recorded cold that felt closer to late autumn than June. That is how these shifts enter history, not as global averages, but as a man stepping into his garden and realizing the season has turned against him. And when one district loses a crop, it is hardship. When many lose at once, it becomes arithmetic. Grain stores thin out, animal feed disappears, and prices begin to rise with a speed that frightens even people who still have bread today. The weather had finished its first pass. Now markets, roads, and kitchens were about to carry the damage further. That is when the cold climbed off the land and entered the market. A failed field does not stay in the field. It moves into the barn, then into the road, then into the price of grain. Across 1816 and into 1817, the damage from the eruption began to travel through ordinary systems. Feed for horses, seed for the next planting, bread for towns, work for laborers. In the United States, the cost of oats surged so sharply that even keeping animals alive became a burden. In Europe, shortages did what shortages always do. They made every loaf feel political. In England, bakeries were attacked. In France, food stores became targets. In the German states, grain had to be guarded. This was not chaos falling from the sky. It was the logic of the year without a summer moving step by step through human life. First, the crop fails, then the reserve shrinks, then fear enters the crowd. And once fear enters a market, it multiplies faster than weather ever could. You can almost hear the sound of it. Wagon wheels in mud, doors barred at night, the brittle snap of dry grain measured too carefully because there is not enough left to waste. Governments could see the unrest in front of them. What they could not see was the whole machine driving it. And hunger rarely travels alone. By the time relief efforts and local controls began to matter, bodies were already weaker, shelters more crowded, and water less safe. The eruption had one more path to take: through disease. Through disease, the damage became even harder to see clearly. An eruption kills fast near the mountain. Hunger and sickness move differently. They arrive in weak legs, hollow faces, crowded shelter, bad water, and bodies that cannot fight off what they once might have survived. That is why the year without a summer was not only a climate event, it was a pressure system on human health. In Bengal, where the monsoon pattern had been disturbed, the strain did not remain local. In 1817, British military doctors were recording a violent intestinal disease spreading through a population already living under stress. They did not know they were watching the opening stage of what would later be called the first cholera pandemic. The chain here matters. The eruption did not invent the bacterium out of thin air. It helped build the conditions in which a pathogen could move faster, farther, and with deadlier force. This is the kind of consequence people miss when they imagine volcanic disaster. They picture fire, sound, ash, a mountain breaking apart. They do not picture a clinic far away, a soaked road, a crowded camp, a cup of unsafe water. But that is how this event kept traveling, as a series of weakened thresholds. And while Bengal was sliding toward epidemic spread, other regions were making a different decision under the same pressure. When crops fail twice, people stop asking how to endure where they are and start asking where they can still go. That question changed maps. After repeated crop failure in New England, people began to leave, household by household. A farm that could not feed a family stopped being a home and became a burden. In Vermont and New Hampshire, the cold seasons after the eruption pushed many to sell what they could, load tools, bedding, seed, iron pots, and move west toward the Ohio and Illinois country. This is one of the stranger effects of Tambora. A volcano on Sumbawa helps move people across North America, not by force of ash, not by a pyroclastic flow, but by arithmetic. 2 weak harvests, rising costs, thin fodder, too little confidence in the next planting. That is enough to loosen people from land that had once looked secure. Historians count this movement in the hundreds of thousands across the years after 1816. Roads filled with carts, river routes grew busy. The sound of the crisis changed again. Not wind and rain now, but axle groans, boots in mud, children riding atop bundles because there was no room left inside the wagon. The same climate shock that helped weaken Bengal for disease was, on another continent, helping redirect settlement. And while some regions were emptying, one place in Europe was doing the opposite. At Lake Geneva, a small group of young people had not gone out on the water, not climbed in the summer light, not taken the warm season they expected, because there was no warm season to step into. That missing summer is how the story enters literature. In 1816, near Lake Geneva, the weather that should have opened windows and drawn people outdoors kept doing the opposite. Rain against glass, damp air in the rooms, low gray light over the water. Lord Byron had come there expecting one kind of season and got another. With him were John Polidori, Mary Godwin, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Claire Claremont, a small circle forced inward by cold and wet that did not belong to June. This matters because climate does not only move grain prices and disease. Sometimes it changes where people sit, how long they stay in one room, what they talk about after midnight, what mood settles over a table when the lake outside is dark and the paths are too muddy to wander. The year without a summer pressed on bodies, but it also pressed on thought. So the days filled differently: reading aloud, storm watching, talk of life, death, and the strange edge where science touches fear. Byron proposed that each of them should write a ghost story. It sounds almost casual when you say it quickly. It was not casual. It happened inside a season already bent out of shape by an eruption half a world away. Mary Godwin was not yet Mary Shelley. She was young, restless, listening, absorbing everything: the weather, the conversation, the tension in the house. And then, one night, unable to sleep, she saw an image in her mind so vivid that it would outlive everyone in that room. That image became Frankenstein. Mary Godwin later described the moment as a waking vision, a young scientist, a made thing, life forced where it should not be, and horror at the result. The book would not appear at once, and the mountain did not write the novel for her. But the chain matters. Cold, rain, confinement, stormlight over Lake Geneva, talk of experiments and the boundary between life and death. All of that formed the room in which the idea could take shape. So when people say a volcano changed literature, this is what they mean: pressure, weather closing doors, time spent indoors instead of outside, conversation turning darker because the season itself felt wrong. The same event that had already damaged crops and helped loosen disease now reached into imagination. And Mary was not the only one altered by that house and that weather. John Polidori, Byron's physician, would write a story that helped shape the modern vampire. Byron himself turned toward darkness in verse. The cold summer on the lake did not create genius from nothing, but it bent mood, routine, and subject matter with remarkable force. This is the strangest part of the chain so far. The eruption moved from mountain to sky, from sky to harvest, from harvest to hunger, and from hunger-era weather to one of the most durable myths in modern culture. But people living through it still did not know these pieces belonged together, and it would take much longer for anyone to prove that they did. That proof arrived long after the people who suffered through it were gone. In 1815 and 1816, nobody could stand under a dim sky in Europe, look east toward Indonesia, and know with certainty that the same eruption was behind the cold, the failed harvests, and the strange light. Thomas Stamford Raffles could collect reports. Sir Humphrey Davy could notice the altered sky. Mary Godwin could sit in that rain-dark house near Lake Geneva and feel the season pressing on her thoughts. But none of them had the tools to connect every piece. That came later, when modern science learned how to read natural archives. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica preserve chemical traces from the atmosphere year by year. In the layers matching 1815 and 1816, researchers found a sharp sulfate signal, the fingerprint of the eruption carried high above the weather. Tree rings in North America told a second part of the same story. In years when growing conditions collapse, trees record it in wood. And suddenly, the scattered witnesses begin to line up. The darkened skies, the delayed monsoon, the cold fields in New England, the hunger, the migration, the disease pressure, the wet summer at Lake Geneva. What had looked like separate disasters became one connected mechanism. A mountain on Sumbawa had reached into climate, and climate had reached into history. But here is the uncomfortable turn. If we can now explain that chain clearly, then we also have to ask what happens when the same chain meets a world far more crowded than theirs. That world is ours. In one sense, we are better prepared than the people of 1815. We understand the mechanism now. We know that sulfur dioxide can rise into the upper atmosphere, become a long-lived veil, and cool the surface below. We know the year without a summer was not folklore, not mass panic, not a coincidence of bad seasons. It was a real atmospheric chain reaction. But understanding a mechanism is not the same as being immune to it. The danger in this story was never only the blast on Sumbawa. The danger was the delay. First the eruption, then the sky changes, then harvest shift, then prices move, then hunger weakens bodies, then disease finds openings, then people leave home. By the time the full pattern is obvious, the pattern is already inside food, trade, transport, and public health. That logic has not gone away. If anything, it has more pathways now. More people depend on stable seasons. More people rely on food grown far away. More systems are linked tightly enough that a failure in one place can travel fast into another. Tambora showed that climate shock does not stay where it begins. It moves through whatever a society depends on most. And that is why this old eruption still feels modern. A mountain broke apart in April 1815, and within a year, it was pressing on farms, ports, roads, sick rooms, and imaginations across half the world. The last step is to see the whole chain at once and ask what exactly made it so powerful. That is why this story does not really stay in the past. The 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora and the year without a summer exposed a kind of weakness that modern life still carries. We have better warnings now and better science, but we also depend on steadier seasons, longer supply lines, and tighter systems than the people of 1815 ever did. If one great volcano loads the stratosphere again, the shock does not have to look dramatic at first. It only has to arrive in the wrong place at the wrong time. That is the part people miss. The mountain is not the whole threat. The threat is the delay, the spread, the way the damage passes through harvests, then prices, then health, then movement. The Dalton solar minimum helped make the old disaster worse, but the real engine was the chain itself, one link pulling the next. And chains do not care whether the year is 1816 or something far more crowded and connected. So the warning is simple, and it is not comforting. A volcano does not need to bury a city to change history. It only needs to change the sky long enough for food, water, and trust to start slipping at the same time. And if that sounds abstract, remember what happened after Tambora. People did not first die from the mountain. They died from everything that came after it. And that is the part we would have to survive again. And that is the full shape of it. In April 1815, Mount Tambora tore itself open on Sumbawa. About 150 cubic kilometers of rock and ash were thrown out in roughly 2 days. Around 60 megatons of sulfur dioxide rose into the high air. Near the mountain came the fast deaths: pyroclastic flow, ash, hunger beginning at once. Far from the mountain came the slower ones. The sky dimmed. The planet cooled by roughly 0.4 to 0.7 degrees Celsius. The Dalton solar minimum made the blow harder. Then came 1816, the year without a summer, and with it failed crops, unrest, disease, migration, and a rain-locked house near Lake Geneva where Mary Shelley found the first spark of Frankenstein. That is the real power of this event. Not that one eruption was loud enough to be remembered, but that it was patient enough to pass through everything people depended on. A red sunset in London, a ruined field in New England, bad monsoon pressure in Bengal, wet glass at Lake Geneva. They look like separate scenes until you realize they were all taking place under the same altered sky. A mountain broke, then bread thinned, roads filled, bodies weakened, and a story about man-made life opened its eyes. And after the haze slowly faded, the world looked ordinary again, which is perhaps the most dangerous thing about systems like this. They can change history and still leave behind a horizon that seems calm. If you want more long-form stories where science and history collide like this, stay with the channel and leave a like. There are more hidden chains like this one.